Welcome to Heart, where we break the silence, bridge the gaps, and bring real conversations about mental health to the forefront. I'm your host, Lee Yaffe, founder and director of The Long Short Road. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Heart. My guest today is Rabbi Johnny Solomon. Rabbi Solomon is a lecturer, rabbi, and posek who works at #the virtual rabbi, providing online spiritual coaching and halachic consultations to men, women, and couples through webyeshiva.org. He's also a lecturer on topics of Tanakh, Emunah, and halacha at Matan. And until recently, he served as the community rabbi at Ramatayim Tzufim in Ramot, Yerushalayim. Rabbi Johnny is married to Donna. He is the father of 5 daughters, and he lives with his family in Evan Shmuel. Rabbi Solomon, welcome to the show. I'm really grateful to have you here. Thank you.
Rabbi Johnny, and my pleasure. Great to see you.
A question that I like to ask all my guests to start us off is, you could tell us, what is your why for, what fuels the things that you're doing, and the roles that you play in your life? Maybe that's too broad. Your role as a virtual rabbi. Let's start with that one.
I grew up in a more traditional background and became more observant as a teenager, but at the same time, I was also blessed to have an amazing community rabbi called Dayan Gershon Lopyan, the grandson of Rav Elia Lopyan, a close student of Rav Moshe Feinstein. He was just such a wonderful, special, warm community rabbi who cared about his flock, but also gave very, very sensitive halachic guidance to all those who turned to him, both members of the community and beyond. And over the years, I realized that both my religious growth and spiritual growth was very much credited to him and my other teachers. But also I realized that many other people don't have rabbis, even though they may go to synagogues, they don't have that kind of relationship with a rabbi. They don't feel they can talk with them. They don't feel they can get personal spiritual counsel. And so I created the virtual rabbi basically in some kind of small, tiny way to follow in the footsteps of my teacher, so that men, women, and couples around the world who are looking for some kind of halachic guidance or spiritual guidance, who want to be able to talk with people being prepared to listen, get to know them, and really understand their background, their context, and give them some kind of concrete direction or at least advice. So that's what I do. That's what the virtual rabbi does.
Wow, that's beautiful. So then your congregation, so to speak, is not just then only in Israel. You're speaking to people around the world.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
That's amazing. So
around the clock as well, different hours.
Right, because you're right. So they could be anywhere. And
yeah.
Wow.
I'll give you an example.
Yes,
I've got a client in LA. I live in Israel. And while this is a relatively newly religious married man who likes learning with me every week, and he's trying to fill some gaps in his Jewish knowledge. And in order to both be a good Jew, be a good father, be a good husband. But whenever it comes to the Chagim, he likes for us to have a session with him and his wife so that we can prepare for the holidays. So when that happens, we time our session at a time when they're both available. So my time, Thursday early morning, I'm going to be having a session with a couple in LA to discuss spiritual preparations for Rosh Hashanah.
Wow. Beautiful. That's beautiful. And I want to go back to something you said before about how many people may attend a synagogue and know a rabbi, but not have a rav or a rabbi. And something that's coming up for me as I was hearing you say that is that for many people from religious backgrounds, they feel sometimes even like a sense of religious trauma or discomfort, don't feel like they have a rav who can actually give them the sensitive halachic guidance that they need for their unique, scenario. Why do you think it's important? What is the importance of the role that a rav can play, and how can we help people who have been spiritually hurt be willing to reconnect? Because I do believe it's such an important aspect of living a spiritually true life, is having a Seilach Rav. But a lot of people are scared of having a rav. So how do we reconcile with that?
So firstly, I want to make it clear, I am the biggest advocate for people going to their local rabbis and rebbitzins. And so I fill the gap when people aren't doing that or don't have that. As I say, I'm playing off the best case scenario, which is what I was privileged to have in the UK. Fundamentally, I take God seriously. I take Torah seriously. And because I take God and Torah seriously, it means that issues arise in my life which I feel are better understood when talking with people who also take God and Torah seriously. So why would some people who may even have a community rabbi not go to them for advice, or a rebbitzin not go to her for advice? It could be because they don't have that background of knowledge. They don't understand that congregant. They don't feel that the rabbi and the rebbitzin know who they are, and they don't feel that they've had the time to get to know them. Meaning, if you're a rabbi and rebbitzin of a shul of like 1,200 families,
Right.
how much do you really know about every member of those families? And the answer is you may know some very well and some just as a name. And if you're one of those names, you don't necessarily feel that if you're going to bring a vulnerable question to somebody that they're necessarily going to give you a bespoke piece of guidance where they haven't invested necessarily in that relationship. By the way, that doesn't make that the Rabbi Rebbitzins' fault, but
Right.
it means at that moment in time, that's how things are. Point number two is that just as much as there are different doctors with different skills, there are different rabbis with different skills. Different doctors have different qualifications, so too, and rabbis. And people need to know that. I'm a strong advocate for people both viewing the rabbinate as a professional venture and rabbis being professional in the work that they do. And what that means is that there are some rabbis who are better at giving sermons and better at leading funerals and less good at giving spiritual counsel and vice versa. And I don't see that as a fault. I see that as simply recognizing that different people have different skills and you need to know who you got and who you're getting. So the work that I do means that I spend a lot of time thinking about sensitive halachic guidance
Mm.
and thoughtful spiritual guidance, which means people are looking for that who turn to me, I hope, receive that, and I generally get that through the feedback and testimonials that I receive. In addition to that, one of the reasons people don't go to necessarily their local rabbi and rebbitzin is because they feel they're going to be judged.
Right.
So if there's something on their mind, they want to share it, but they don't want to be judged. And all too often, even if the rabbi and rebbitzin isn't doing that, people feel that they are.
Right.
That means that they need to work harder, perhaps, to give off the messaging that they are non-judgmental spiritual leaders. But as
Mm.
long as people might think that they are, many of their congregants will be reluctant to necessarily go and share something that has happened or something that they've done that they're not particularly proud of. And fourthly, sometimes there's a certain religious language that different rabbis speak. You know, some people belong to the more halachic Talmudic world, and some belong to the more, spiritual Hasidic world, and different people have different leanings. I kind of touched on that before, but person wants to know that the music that speaks to them
Mm.
is a music that their spiritual guide is singing or playing.
Ooh.
So it's really a question of, we look for soulmates in terms of marriage partners, but we also need to look for spiritual soul guides,
Right.
and it needs to fit. And so when the rabbis say Aseh Harav, they recognize that it's a process, it's a journey. The Talmud is replete of stories of people traveling very, very far to find the right person. In fact, one of the few excuses and justifications for leaving the land of Israel is to find a Torah teacher that speaks to you.
Oh.
And so if you don't have that, my message to an individual is go find them, because your life can and should be enriched by somebody who takes the time to get to know you and who can provide you serious, worthy, appropriate advice about things that matter. And I believe God matters, and I believe Torah matters.
Wow, beautiful. And I so appreciate that metaphor of like you go to different doctors for different things.
Sure.
Right, you go to different rabbis for different things, and that they all have different roles to play. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit before we started recording. One of the things that we had talked about is that as leaders, we end up learning a lot from our students.
Mhm.
And so though I am very curious to hear if you have stories that you can share, obviously, like, not giving identifiable details about the kinds of things that people have come to you for guidance. I'm actually curious first to hear from you in your role as a Rav and as a posek. What have you learned from people? Like, what have you learned from the people who are coming to you for guidance?
I've learned more, shall we say. There are things I knew, but I didn't know anywhere near as much as I know now.
Hmm.
I know that people are worlds unto themselves. Every person's a universe to themselves. And that to have the privilege of supporting somebody, I have a responsibility of learning as much as I can about them by asking them questions and by listening. And so a real conversation that I have with one of my clients or congregants is where they talk a lot more than me. It's where my job is to get a sense of who is this person and to ask follow-up questions because I should be curious about who they are, what they love doing, what are their challenges, how they see themselves. So point number one is every person is a world unto themselves, and to have the hubris of imagining that before you address a particular spiritual halachic question, a minute or two is enough to get to know somebody is
Right.
absurd. So I put in a lot of time to get to know people before we even get to whatever the subject is, because ultimately the real subject is that person.
Mm.
In fact, on that point, when my beloved teacher passed away, and I was living in Israel, and a dear friend was going to give a hesped at his levaya. And so Dain Lopin was renowned for people calling him with questions. And I said to my friend, when you give your hesped, tell them he didn't answer shilas. So my friend said, shilas means, halachic queries, right? So my friend said, what are you talking about? That's what he did the whole time. I said, no, he answered shalim. He
Mm.
answered questioners.
Mm.
That's what the Dayan did. That's what made him special.
Oh.
I don't answer questions. I'm there to be with people who may have things going on in their life, of which some may be questions, some may be explorations. But the focal point is the person.
Mm.
So the first thing I learn is how complex people are, how broad people's lives can be, how bumpy people's lives can be. In addition to that, there are things which I thought were of significance, which I've come to realize are of more significance. We
Mm.
mentioned one before we started recording, and I'll mention that, and I'll mention another as well. Before we started recording, I noted how miscarriages can have a huge impact on the way a woman lives after suffering a miscarriage. Now, I knew that as a fact,
Right.
but having been asked to offer spiritual guidance, halachic guidance to women who have suffered miscarriages, I realize at least more now than I did before how deep that pain can go. And that's something which, if you then learn that, and you learn that with an open heart and with open mind, obviously, you then bring that to your future conversations. I'll give you another one. Those who marry later in life, in their definition of late,
Mm.
okay, often carry that with them, both in terms of some of the decisions they make within marriage
Mm.
and the perception they have in terms of being married. So a person can be having a rocky marriage, but if they married late, they may well be more reluctant to perhaps rock the boat.
Mm.
Um, that may be useful in some areas, it may be disastrous in others.
Right.
So sometimes people, call for halachic advice when they're considering or in the process of divorce.
Mm.
And the fact that that issue comes up in that moment is both a curiosity, but an important factor to bear in mind that certain life choices and life decisions and life experiences at certain ages and stages in life shape us for far, far longer. And on a third level, we were speaking before about not knowing things until you experience them. Well, I've been both interested in and invest quite a lot of time in learning the laws of Avelut, of mourning.
Mm.
And then just about 8 months ago, my mother passed away quite unexpectedly.
Mm.
And I can tell you that all the books are a whole different experience to the loss of a parent.
Right. Of
I
course.
can tell you the law is, I can tell you the halacha,
Right.
but I could never tell you what it feels like to stand in front of the body of somebody you love
Right.
and tear your clothes and say Kaddish until I did it.
Right.
I could tell you in theory, but the theory is miles away from reality.
Right.
And so we should always be wary to not be presumptuous
Yeah.
about the emotional state of others who are going through tough times, even if we have gone through similar times, and certainly if we've not. And so a person who gives answers really needs to be asking a lot more questions, because really it's through the asking that we're able to give useful counsel to
Right.
those in need.
Right. Yeah. Wow. It really, we're doing the work is so much more than of being that open space for them to feel seen and having
Mhm.
that real felt sense of being seen. It's not right because you could know all like you could be bucking all the halachas. It's about getting to know person to person.
It's about, obviously, more than anything else, caring.
Right.
I'll tell you something which I do. I do as just a standard, by the way. You know, before the big fast of the Jewish year, Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, rabbis, rabbis of concrete shuls and virtual rabbis like me get a lot of calls from people who are in need of guidance. It's important to state, if the rabbi is not qualified to make any comment about a particular medical condition, they shouldn't be making any comment about a particular medical condition. And they should either be consulting or telling that individual to be seeking guidance from a doctor. But often there are particular situations of certain conditions where a rabbi is qualified to give guidance, halachic guidance, and it could be, pregnant women, feeding mothers. It could be people with certain different conditions where, in some instances, you'd say they shouldn't be fasting. Sometimes you'd say they should, with certain criteria. More important than the answers I give is that after the fast, I message or call every single person I gave counsel to before. And I
Mm,
said, how was it? How are you? Firstly, it's important because it's important. Secondly, it's actually important in terms of professionally knowing that what you said makes sense.
mm,
Now, I believe in what I'm saying. I'm trained, I'm capable, but follow up matters.
mm,
Whenever I meet with people, I follow up. I check in with people. I check in with my clients. If I haven't heard from them for a few weeks, I want to know how they're doing. They know to get a random message from me is a norm. They
mm.
know when I ask them how they're doing. I really, really want to know.
Right.
And that becomes the fabric of a real yet professional, relationship where you share that you care. You demonstrate your interest in the well-being of another.
Right.
And it's not a game. I assure you, straight after Yom Kippur, as I come home and after I have a few things to eat, that's the first thing I do. And it's important because knowing that a person got through things the way you wanted them to, and according to the plan that you'd perhaps worked through with an individual, is the way you make sure that they realize that you were concerned
Right.
and that they were on your mind.
Yeah. No, it's really that's such a necessary, I think, I'm thinking in terms of like from like the mental health perspective and when I speak to people and I support people, that feeling of knowing that someone is not only giving you guidance but also following up to that's just I think lead to like a feeling of a sense of wholeness, right? Like because we've been seen. And I think that often gets underestimated and people maybe have not. I work with most of the people that I've, have supported over the years have never felt seen before.
Right.
It's right. Or they've been given advice or guidance that is so detrimental to their well-being
Mm.
and is so counterintuitive to what they need that it kind of, derails the journey a little bit.
I'll give you an example just of that. I volunteer to officiate at weddings for generally less observant couples in Israel, and people register through this organization called SOAR, and then they find me and we meet, and I meet the couple, and I do the wedding, and I try and do some follow up as well. However, every once in a while, I'm in contact with the bride and groom and it just doesn't work out, meaning the date that they wanted me to be available, I'm not. But we had that touch point of contact. So that's what happened about 6 weeks ago, where a bride was looking for a rabbi and she found my detail online and she messaged me with some questions. I said, I don't know if I'm able to do the wedding, but I'm happy to answer some of those questions. We had a conversation or two, and it was her wedding yesterday.
Oh, wow.
And so yesterday morning, because I knew when the wedding was, and this is somebody I've never met and somebody I wasn't officiating at their wedding, but we'd had a conversation or two. It's somebody who was less observant, somebody who's had some rough times in her Jewish journey, as has her fiance. So remembering it was her wedding day, I sent her a message and just blessed her, blessed her that everything should go well. And I have my phone in front of me. She said, "First, happy tears of the day. Thank you so, so much."
Wow.
And to know it's not what I said. What I said was just cute stuff, right? It's that it's about, as you say, being seen. A Jew who felt that she was completely invisible.
Wow.
And she reached out to a rabbi who in the end had no direct impact on the officiating of the wedding. But that rabbi made the time to have those conversations and made the effort to be in contact on the wedding day. That's what it means to see a fellow Jew.
Yeah.
And that stays with somebody forever.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that you matter, that
Right.
you count, that you are seen. And especially as you mentioned, the field of mental health, alachat kama v'chama,
Right.
right? So much more so. When a person is struggling and they feel misunderstood, and they often feel even living in the margins of certain aspects of our society, and you say to that person, you count, and you say to that person, I want to hear from you, and I'm
Yeah.
reaching out to you, and I want to listen to you, and please tell me. That's that's the essence of what it means
Right.
to give of yourself, of your time, of your skills, of your listening, of your cares, and more important than this, although not seen. When I daven, at the end of my Amidah, every single Amidah, I daven for those people. I
Wow.
daven for my children, but I daven for all the people I'm privileged to know and meet. And
Wow.
when you carry their stories and their lives in your prayers, and you basically beseech God and you say, help this person, give this person what they need, support this person. And every once in a while, if it may arise, you say, I daven for you. Of course, in some instances, a person doesn't want to hear that, but in some instances, by saying that, you pray for me. I said, sure, I care. I pray for people who they should be successful, and I
Right.
care about, of course. It's everything.
Right.
It's everything.
Yeah. No, it's something that's coming to mind for me right now as you're saying this is sometimes people who I've been in touch with for, sometimes 4 or 5 years, they always reach out when they're needing like to set up a time with me with an apology. I'm sorry to bother you. I'm sorry to take you away from your time. You're with your family. I was like, this is what I'm here to be of service to you. Like,
Mm,
please don't apologize to me. Please, like, thank you for the schos of
right.
right. It's a very deep responsibility and schos to walk alongside someone on their journey. Spiritual, mental, physical, like being human is very hard. And when we have, people who can walk alongside us, it makes we can't take the challenges away from people. I tell people all the time, like when I get on the phone with someone, sometimes, most times, they're presenting challenges to me that I can't solve, but to lighten the load of saying, I'm here with you, here with you it's a big, important undertaking.
It's huge. I used the word taboo before. Our community, in different ways, sometimes intentionally and sometimes just the way it is, has meant that certain issues, challenges are taboo. So I'll give you an example which has arisen many times in the past few years of my work as a virtual rabbi. There are married couples who have an image that everything's going great when the reality is everything is not going great. Now, in the right world, what they'll do is they'll talk things through, they'll go to a marriage counselor, and they'll try and do what they can to improve what is weak and strengthen what is strong. And some will bump along and some won't. But things will be done above the table in a way that they both recognize we're in it together,
Mhm.
warts and all. Okay. However, there are situations where people are in strained marriages where that's just not a possibility,
Right.
or it's been sought but not been acquiesced to. And so, what does the other partner do? Well, if the other partner has close friends, they should be perhaps talking through some of the challenges they have. Or if they have a therapist, they should be doing that with a therapist. But in the Jewish community, sometimes people don't want to talk about the imperfections of their life because there is a facade, there's an image, right? There's what people will say, what neighbors will think, even those who know a lot about the challenges you may have experienced in terms of, job or school, whatever. And so what people do is they don't share
Right.
and they carry these things with them. And and that's an incredibly lonely and painful thing. And once in a while, I've been contacted by men or women in that kind of situation who aren't talking to anybody else. And I'll encourage them to try and identify a friend or two. I said, listen, I can help you to a certain measure, but you need a friend who can give you a hug.
Yeah.
You need a friend who can come over to you every once in a while. You need a friend you can have a drink with, talk through things on a whole different level. I'm a resource, but certainly need more than that.
Right.
But there are situations where people are afraid of being, the word cancelled is inappropriate, but basically being seen as lesser or as a failure, sugbet, as they say in Hebrew,
Wow, I haven't
and
heard that term in years.
right.
But
So,
right, it
so
is.
what we need to do is firstly, obviously, normalize people getting help when they need
Right.
uh, therapeutic help, medical help, mental health help, wherever possible. But also normalize the ability to talk. If our community speaks about mental health issues, then it
Right.
becomes less taboo. If
Right.
a community talks about different marriages have differing levels of strengths and challenges, it
Yeah.
becomes slightly less taboo.
Yeah.
So when people with voices, people with platforms speak about delicate issues in the right way, we give people a voice and we give people the space
Right.
to actually share what's going on in their life. Because if you're carrying something like that on your own or other mental health challenges on your own, sometimes you yourself just explode.
Right.
And that was based on the premise that you had nobody to speak to. And I know that your work is involved in suicide prevention. And I think when I was in first contact with you, I said uh, just a little bit more than a year ago, a very close friend of mine died by suicide. And I can tell you even now, I'm still perplexed by it.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing that a close friend was carrying things and whatever reason didn't reach out makes me wonder, what am I doing and what are we doing to make it known that whatever it is, please reach out.
Yeah.
I can't change what happened there, but I can try and make it clear that whatever you're dealing with, let's talk without judgment. Let's talk, right? Talking helps. Michelet mentions how talking is therapeutic. Talking, it can provide healing. So we need to give space for those conversations in our community.
I Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And I'm so sorry about your loss of it's really, something I said to someone once, I think I've repeated this a few times, maybe even on the show, that, in all of my years of doing suicide prevention, I could walk, many of the people who I'm supporting, I'm never meeting in person because I'm speaking to them over the phone, right?
Mm,
But I know based on the conversations that I'm having that there's a certain amount of people, there's probably more that are not reaching out to me, but there are, if I would walk into, say, Crown Heights or Borough Park or Williamsburg or Lakewood, I know that, every other house on one particular block has had a particular challenge, but they'll never come to, it's very, very difficult and very challenging to no one wants to be the one to break the ice. But then once the ice is broken, it's like, what? You too? Me too? I'm not the only one who's going through this. It's
yeah.
really so many people when I speak to them over the years. I've heard this dozens of times. Someone will call me who's struggling with suicidality and they're like, there's no one else like me in the frum community. And I'm like, well, there's no one else who's uniquely you, who's going through your unique challenges, for sure.
Mm,
But there are others who are fighting this battle as well. And it's
yeah.
it's not only you, you know?
Not everything can be broadcast. Not everything should be broadcast.
Right.
But we have a duty to make things known, to give space for those who need to talk, and to give our community the ability to learn more about the things that need to be spoken about. You
Right.
know, before we started recording, I mentioned how 4 years ago my wife was going through breast cancer treatment. Thank God she's well now. But we made a decision, which is we're going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about every appointment and every conversation, but for us, talking about the journey of breast cancer is a way for people to talk about the journey of breast cancer, which many people experience.
Right.
And the amount of people still just, in fact, just it wasn't 2 days ago. In fact, no, yesterday, some good friends of ours have started that same journey.
Mm,
They reached out just a few weeks ago. Why did they reach out? Because we were open about it.
right.
And we had a very big heart to heart and shared some spiritual tips, some philosophical tips, but also practical tips. I'll tell you a practical tip. A practical tip which seems so small, it's just to my mind a no-brainer. When my wife and I would go to the oncology department in Ashdod for my wife's treatments, and we were lucky to have the same nurse pretty much every time. And before my wife would start her treatment, I'd go to the local store and get her like a shake, like a fruit shake, to give her some energy. But I'd also go get one for her nurse
Mm,
because I want the nurse to have energy, right? We'd sit down, I'd say, okay, Donna, what would you like? I'd ask the nurse, what would you like? I'd go off 10 minutes later, and it wasn't trying to bribe or anything like that. I was just looking after the two people that mattered to me most in that room, which is my wife and the person looking after my wife. So I said this to my friend just yesterday. He said, thank you so much for sharing that. My wife and I, we started treatments, and I go and get my wife whatever the things she wants. And I've also did the same for the nurse. When I did it, the nurse said she hadn't eaten all day and she was so exhausted. Thank you so much. And you realize, talking about things means the opportunity to share not just the really complicated, difficult challenges of, in that case, illness or weakness and hair loss and all those other real, real tough stuff. But also the practical things of buy a nurse a shake or
right.
whatever else, right? Look after the people who are looking after your loved ones.
Right.
Obviously, it's a no-brainer. It's Muvan Me'elav. And my friend is now doing that. And the fact that there was a nurse who was in an oncology department who hadn't eaten that morning, right? Was walking around doing life-saving care. And through a minor conversation, it meant that she then was sustained. It just goes to show. So again, not every conversation can be broadcast,
Sure.
but there are things we can say about things that need to be said. And
Right.
even if it's not about us, it can be other people. And we need to normalize the fact that there are many people in pain. There are many people going through tough things. There are many people who are blessed. But don't ever imagine that just because things look nice on the outside, that things are absolutely fine on the inside.
Yeah.
And recognize, lean into people when they start talking, because often you'll find they have a lot to say.
It's very true. And I think that listening has become a lost art.
Mm,
We're very focused today on getting our part of the conversation out, right? So we listen with the intention of forming a response. We immediately come in with judgments. We interrupt, right? We want our piece to be heard. And also, though, part of showing that you care is sometimes having that open silence of not filling the air with words, you know?
uh-huh. As I'll say, a wise person is silent. There's a great story of Rav David Cohen who went to Rav Aryeh Levine, and Rav Aryeh was learning, and he had a question. Rav Aryeh was silent, but then with a few minutes, he felt he got the answer, and he told the story to somebody. They said, "Oh no, it was a student going to Rav David." They said, "Oh no, Rav David speaks. He just speaks in silence." You know, we have to get rid of the noise in our heads and attune ourselves to listen to the still silent voice of God, as it says in the book of Ezekiel, right? The still silent voice, not just of God, but of so many others.
Right,
So many people have much to say, but they don't yet have the words to express themselves. And simply being present speaks volumes. That's what we do when we comfort mourners. We don't speak,
right,
but our presence speaks volumes. Even when somebody is sick, sometimes it's best just to be there. And often when you're checking in with somebody, you don't have to send a big message. hi, checking in, how you doing? A few words say so much.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we can, I think that's helpful for the listeners to hear because some people are like, oh, but I'm not in a position of leadership. Okay, but so what? You're in a position of having a soul-to-soul connection with someone.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most beautiful insights taught by Rabbi Sachs, who I was privileged to learn from. It's just so stunning that I'm not going to do it justice, but nonetheless, I'll give it a go. We learn about the three daily prayers from our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And there's a biblical verse describing each of their prayers at a different time of the day, which teaches us that Abraham prayed in the morning, Isaac prayed in the afternoon, and Jacob, Yaakov prayed in the evening. So in terms of Yitzchak, we're told, "V'yetzi Yitzchak lasuach basadeh," and Yitzchak went out, which is often translated means to meditate in the field. So he went out in the afternoon. We therefore learn that Yitzchak established the afternoon prayer. Rabbi Sachs notes that the word lasuach means to converse. Sicha means a conversation. He says, well, that suggests that when we pray, it's like having a conversation with God. But then he takes it on the flip side and he says, that also means that when we have conversations, it's like having and saying a prayer. Like whenever I meet clients, I feel we're having a prayerful communion. Two people are sharing things from their heart and soul before God, trying to improve themselves. That's a prayer. This conversation is itself, it's a prayer. It's a prayer that we hope that through talking about these important subjects, that we each grow and those who listen to this conversation gain from it too. It's a prayerful conversation. And even if a person isn't in a leadership position, every conversation they have can be a prayer to help another, their child, their neighbor, somebody they know, somebody they don't know, right? Sometimes just a few words can save a life.
Yeah.
A few words certainly can make a person feel that their life is worth living. So every conversation we have has a potential of being as holy as the greatest prayers because we're investing in those words that desire that that person is both seen and heard and that they recognize that they matter in the eyes of God and other people.
That's such a beautiful, I feel like I'm gonna have a completely different outlook on how I have conversations, even with like the people at the checkout counter at the grocery store. I've had,
100%
you know,
more. In fact, the not even the mystics. Our sages say that the mundane conversations of the righteous are holy, right? So, I mean, I don't need to come up with a sophisticated Torah source to teach these ideas. A mundane conversation, you go to a store on a Thursday or Friday, and the checkout man or woman would say, remind you, this is Lichvud Shabbos Kodesh, right? Don't forget, whatever you're purchasing is for Shabbat. They're reminding you about the sacred nature of whatever you're doing, right? This morning I was on a call with a bank, and I just wish somebody had said, thank you, Tadika, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Who knows what kind of day that person is having? But all of a sudden, you basically tell them that they're a wonderful person, they're a good person, you appreciate their service. And that person moves on with their day feeling much more purposeful, with more confidence, more self belief. The smallest of conversations can make the greatest of differences. And for some people, they are expressive of the ultimate prayer that they wish be fulfilled, that people see them and they hear them, and they know them and they value them. So, yeah, there's no such thing as a mundane conversation when it's invested in meaning. Because, we were talking about students before, right? What's amazing is I taught in high schools for about 12, 15 years in the UK. Then I came to Israel, I taught in SEMS for about 10 years. And now I do more of this work as a virtual rabbi. When you meet former students, the conversations you thought were most important are really the conversations your students think are most important.
so true. It's so
And
true.
a student will say, in England, they called me sir, because that's just the way they do it in this kind of form. Sir, do you remember that time you said? And rarely do I remember that time I said, because for me, this is just a throwaway comment. Yeah.
Right.
For that individual student, that comment meant everything. Either it built them or it crushed them.
Oh,
But and you sometimes don't know. Sometimes you get it wrong and you didn't even realize. Um, but a word matters, and so yeah, conversations, expressions, the tone of how we speak, even when we say the right thing,
right.
everything. We build people up by the words we say, and the words we say stay on with us for the rest of our life. So
Yep.
I look back at my teacher, Diane Loppian, and some of the more mundane conversations stay with me, with other teachers, with parents, my mother, with friends. They're right with me. And so these conversations are the prayers that accompany us, prayers to either hope for more or prayers sometimes where people think we're less. But whatever they do, they can motivate us and they can lift us, they push us and boost us to grow and go. Michael Chael.
That's so beautiful. And I'm never going to see conversations the same. Now I have to go do my grocery shopping
I have to send you the original words of Rabbi Sachs. I told you I've quoted this idea like 100 times, but the way he writes things, explains things is stunning. It's an absolute game changer. And I'll tell you where I use this in my spiritual coaching. There are times when I meet people who say, I struggle with prayer.
Hmm.
They say, listen, I believe in God. I like the Jewish religion. I don't do prayer. I had a traumatic prayer experience when I was in my teenage years, or I was forced to pray. I just don't do prayer. So some people will try and teach them how to love prayer again. That's not what I do. I actually have a three-pronged attack on such a conversation. It's not a really attack, but it's an approach that I've used. I begin with a quote of Rav Kook. Rav Kook, in his introduction to his commentary on the Siddur called En Ayah, tells us something stunning, which is that our soul is always praying.
Hmm.
Meaning, there is something which we do called prayer, which is a physical expression of what our soul is always doing, but our soul is always praying. So when somebody said, I don't pray, I say, I don't know if you're aware, but according to Rav Kook, your soul is always praying.
Hmm.
That makes them say, really? I said, listen, I mean, you can agree with him or not, but how would that make you feel if you know that your soul is always praying, even when you've not said any formal prayer? They'd say, wow, that kind of makes sense. Because if the soul is part of God, and my part of God is kind of connecting to the mothership called God, then it makes sense that my soul is always kind of sending waves back and forth. I said, yeah, that's how I understand it. And that makes them pause. Then I share this teaching of Rabbi Sachs. I said, well, even if you haven't opened a Siddur and you haven't been to synagogue, what would you say about the idea that every conversation can be a prayer? They say, what do you mean? And we'll go through the idea. And I'd say, have you ever had a conversation in recent days or weeks where you've helped somebody in need, or you felt that you've lifted them through the conversations you've had? And most people would say yes. I said, well, it wasn't just a conversation. It was like a prayer that you can be there for them in their hour of need. And they say, well, yeah, I suppose so. So I said, well, that's kind of considered to be a prayer. And then there's an idea that, Abraham Joshua Heschel expressed when he marched with Martin Luther King, that famous picture. He said, when I was marching with MLK, I was praying with my feet. I
Hmm.
said, well, some people, they pray not just with their soul and with their words, but also with their actions. Some people pray. I didn't see, my grandmother pray so much from a siddur, but she prayed with her hands when she cooked food for those in need. That's a prayer for her, that people have what they need. And they said, well, that's true. I do things which I really wish to make a difference in the world. I said, well, there you go. And when you bring it together, a person who thinks they don't pray comes to realize my soul is always praying through some of the most sensitive conversations I'm having praying. And through some of the things I do, I'm doing active prayer. And then their perception is no longer I'm a non-praying Jew.
Right.
They see themselves as a Jew who prays in many different ways.
Hmm.
It gives a person back that sense of agency. If you define prayer narrowly, then those who don't do that thing think that they're not in the camp of prayers.
Right.
If you define prayer broadly, then people who are good are always praying in different ways. And maybe once in a while they also utter a formal or informal prayer to God too.
Right. Right.
It's a completely different way of seeing things. But each time I've shared that with people, it's made them feel at peace with their belonging to a tradition which takes prayer seriously, but also recognizing that prayer comes in many shapes and sizes.
Right. I'm thinking now as you're saying this about so many people who I know who are not formally religious, right? They're
Mm.
not Shomer Shabbos, they're not Shomer Mitzvah, but they're the most spiritual people I know because the way they lead in the world and the way they show up for people in the world, like I know people who look the part who don't do that. You know what I mean? So it's just, I think that we get stuck in these labels and boxes of what we're supposed to look like and what does it mean to be a Jew and what does it mean to be a spiritual person. There's many ways of engaging our neshama in this physical world.
Totally. Rabbi Sachs actually has a nice piece where he compares religion and spirituality to being the difference between marriage and love. He says there are people in marriages without love and people in love without being in marriage. Ideally, you should have both.
Right.
But there are many Jews who feel spiritually attuned with their soul, but don't see themselves as being a reflection of that narrow box called the religious person.
Mm.
The problem, though, is, as I say, that box is often made far too small for actually the core representation of the majority of Jews.
Right.
And too often we have random checkboxes which we think are the definitions of religious, which are not. Um, so interestingly, there's a rabbi in Israel called Rabbi Eliezer Malamed. He's a book they brought out a couple of years ago on conversion.
Mm.
And often we say when a person converts to Judaism, they have to keep all the laws. Well, the idea is ideally, yes, but they certainly need to keep the mitzvot. So then we kind of ask ourselves, so which would they need to commit to keep all the mitzvot? But practically, one needs to keep, a meaningful expression of them. But what is on that list? So some people would say Shabbat and Kashrut and other things, which are, of course, incredibly important. I'm an Orthodox Jew, I'm a rabbi. These are really important things to me. He said, but maybe there should be other things on the list.
Mm.
You know, people who are involved in charity work. That's a mitzvah, right? The Torah talks about chesed and charity. People who care about the land of Israel. That's surely an important feature in the Torah. Israel is a center point for the Jewish people. People who defend the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Surely that too is a mitzvah, right? So if we make our lists narrow, then we exclude people. If we make them authentically broad, meaning not broad while playing games, but authentically broad, then we realize, the Jewish people is made up of those in shapes and sizes, and too often we alienate others because we say they don't carry our label.
Right.
But who are we to make labels?
Right.
The only label that matters is, are you an Eved Hashem? Are you a servant of God? Every servant of God is flawed. There's no righteous person in the world that doesn't sin.
Yep.
So who's to say that your sin is any better than that person? If
Mm.
you're more learned, it's worse, by the way, traditionally.
Right.
So a Jew who keeps less but kisses a mezuzah and cares deeply about Shabbat and festivals, and me who apparently keeps a lot more, but the mistakes I make are made from a place of knowing, I don't know. And that's why we come to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, hopefully with a sense of humility. If I presume, if I have the arrogance to think that I'm somehow on the higher echelons of religious and spiritual accomplishment simply because, I have a few more Jewish books in my house, my kitchen has kosher food, and I wear a kippah and I have the title rabbi, then really I've lost sight of God in my life because God knows my struggles, but also God knows my failings. And all of us are on a journey of, as you call it, right? It's a long, short road, right?
Road.
It, it, it's a journey which is attuned to where we come from and and charts the way to where we could get to
Yeah.
and where we find ourselves. That's where God judges us.
Yeah.
And only God can do that.
Right. May I share a story with you that's coming to
Pleasure. I want to listen.
I run already for about 3 years writing classes, like trauma informed therapeutic writing classes.
Hmm.
And about a week ago, I had an opportunity and a schos and also an immense challenge to teach it in Hebrew for the first time for a group
Wow.
of soldiers who have been out of Gaza for only about 3 months. Many who were significantly injured physically, significantly injured spiritually, who lost friends, who are, right? I like walked into that room with such a sense of trepidation because they are like, just such a sense of awe towards them.
Hmm.
So we did 3 prompts together. And it's very funny because I know going in, like, this isn't going to be the usual chatty group of people that I get in these kinds of classes. Like, these are IDF soldiers. They're mostly men. They're not going to like start opening up about, but maybe I'll be wrong. I'll go with an open mind. So we did 3 prompts. And the last prompt that I did with them is one that I've kind of been toying around with my students for a little bit, especially now in the month of Elul. We have this Hasidic idea of we're meeting Hashem in the field. The king is in the field and
Hmm.
Hashem is coming to meet us where we're at. So the prompt was, okay, you meet Hashem in the field. What happens next? Like, now what? And I immediately start writing this very angry letter to Hashem about all the issues that I have with things that happened this year and what I would like to see different and how much pain I'm in, da da da. And mind you, these soldiers are almost all of them completely secular, right? Covered in tattoos. And one raises his hand. When we finished, I was like, no pressure, obviously, but does anyone want to share anything that came up for them? And one of the soldiers who had, I think, lost 8 or 9 friends in one, he was the only survivor from that explosion, spent the entire letter writing a letter of gratitude to Hashem for every miracle that happened to him in Gaza.
Hmm.
And it kind of made me fall back in my seat a little bit of like, I cover my hair, I keep Shabbos, I do all the mitzvahs, I do all the things. Here is somebody who doesn't do those things and is schooling me in what it means to be an Eved Hashem. And it was just such a beautiful, humbling realization that we're all doing our work in different, like no one's work looks the same to each other, you know? Every person's way of connecting is so different, but there's 70 faces to the Torah. We can't isolate ourselves into one, particular box.
Hmm. These are, to say these are our heroes is an understatement. Uh, I personally think any soldier walks into the room, you got to stand up. I mean, these are people who be mice and nefesh, absolute, for the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland. And especially given the fact that quite a lot of my close relatives in Israel are what people would call secular, which means I spend a lot of time with them and with their neighbors and friends. And I know that world. I
Mm.
know how they are misunderstood from the more religious world,
Yeah.
how there are ridiculous assumptions made about the religious loyalties and spiritual commitments of what I would call in inverted commas secular Jews, because most of them, that word secular is ridiculous. It's a sociological label, but it's not a spiritual religious label. And whilst you were speaking, I was going back to October 7th. I live 20 kilometers from the Gaza border. On that morning, apart from all the sirens, we had police officers telling us to go in our house, lock the door. There were terrorists who could be coming towards us. They later found maps, and if they would have had their way, they would have come to where I live. So after we davened, we were up early that day, and because of where I live, we had to be in contact with our neighbors to have a sense of what was going on in terms of security, in terms of making sure people are okay, in terms of the gates of this yeshuv where I live. So I was on my phone. Oh, it's a religious neighborhood, but that is obviously a very life dangerous situation. And at some point, I said, we need to know what's going on in the news. Turn on the news, and it was on for the rest of the day.
Mm.
So I can tell you what happened. I mean, you can see this if you want recordings. For many hours, the kids who ran from the Nova Festival hid in orange groves, wherever they could, far away from the Hamas terrorists. And they were there till dusk.
Mm.
And there were a few people who went out to try and find them once we're able to overcome the terrorists in that area. And as it happens, a news channel was able to be there just about that time, and they met Israelis literally coming out of hiding.
Mm.
And they said, "What have you been doing?" They said, "We've been saying Tehillim."
Wow.
Of course, it was saying Shema. Of course, there's a presumption that Israeli kids who traveled on a Shabbat and a Chag to a party, would be disconnected. That's an offense, by the way. I take offense as a Jew and as a Jew who knows such kids. They were saying Shabbat, Shema. They were saying Tehillim. They were crying out to God. Don't ever, ever make an assumption about the level of religious and spiritual loyalty of somebody who, in a particular chapter in their life, seems to be living a very different religious life to you.
Yep.
Again, it's offensive, it's hubris, but it's also simply false. We say about Am Yisrael, Im einam ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim hem, right? Jews carry a profound spark of connection with God. Every Jew has a unique neshama.
Mm.
And sometimes that neshama is more fanned, and sometimes perhaps it maybe will be more dulled in a particular chapter in life, but it's there and it resonates and it's constantly praying to God. And those Jews prayed harder than they've ever prayed before, as we did when realizing what was taking place. The Jewish people prayed together then and since then. And we need to maintain that sense of unity where we are blind to whether a person is, in our definition of religious or not, because firstly, what do we know?
Right.
And secondly, Kadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be Am Echad. We said at the end of the Amidah, Sim Shalom, right? The prayer for peace involves Kulanu Ke'echad.
Right.
Peace is predicated on us saying Kulanu Ke'echad.
Mm.
Every single time we use language which cuts up and divides the Jewish people into different sects, we don't realize we are ultimately one army, one people, one nation. We do harm to the Jewish people. There's an amazing and yet frightening pasuk in the beginning of Parshat Re'eh, where it describes the mourning customs of the pagans in the time of the Tanakh.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, Lo titzgodadu, right? Do not cut yourselves, literally self-harm, when people have died. It used to be practiced when people were so saddened by the loss of a loved one, people would self-harm, and the Torah prohibits it. By the way, when I say prohibits, that means those who self-harm need support. You should never frighten them by the Torah prohibiting them, but the Torah does talk about self-harm as something which one shouldn't do in terms of mourning practices. Yet, the rabbis learned something interesting. From that same verse, they say, just as you're not allowed to cut yourself, you're not allowed to cut the Jewish people into different bits.
Mm.
What it's got to do is a prohibition of dividing up the Jewish people.
Yeah.
Why? Because that's self-harm.
Wow.
The ultimate self-harm, according to rabbis, is fracturing the Jewish people between the ins and the outs, the people like me and the people not like me. That is the ultimate self-harm to Am Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you want peace? Kulanu ke'echad. You've got to see each other as brothers and sisters. Yeah, by the way, you can feel annoyed with your brother and your sister, right? Just as you would do in your own family. As long as you see them as your brother and sister, warts and all, challenges and all, great, I'm with you.
Right.
That's what you need to do.
Right. And it's self-harm because we are all one. We are all whole.
Me'achuz.
And it makes me...
It's right there. The Gemara says, the Gemara in Yavamas and Yudalad, right? It's part, that's the meaning of, in fact, the Chavetz Chaim has a beautiful piece on that pasuk in his commentary on the Torah. Somebody went up to the Chavetz Chaim and said, if God really wants the Jewish people to be one, how come there's so many different types of Jews? How come they're Hasidim, Misnagdim, Sfardim, Ashkenazim? So Chavetz Chaim says the following: go to the Russian Tsar and ask how come his army is made up of different divisions, horse soldiers, those on the cannon, right? Those with the tanks or whatever. And he'd say, well, the Tsar would say, they're all fighting the same army, they're all standing in different positions. He says, Ein Achanam, the same with the Jewish people. As long as you know that we're all fighting on the same team, we can have Hasidim, Misnagdim, Ashkenazim, and Sfardim, as long as we know we're on the same team. The problem is when you don't realize you're on the same team. That's when you self-harm.
Yeah.
So we need to celebrate the diversity of the Jewish people while underpinning that with an understanding that we are all on the same side, working together, brothers and sisters. And that's what our brothers and sisters have been doing, going out and fighting for us. And we need to tell them, we are with you. We are with you 110%. Because the greatest strength a soldier has is knowing the Jewish people are behind them. And that's a minimum. I didn't go to the army, but I live in a neighborhood where a lot of my friends do. And I feel kind of a bit like a fake, right? Like when my friends are putting on their million uniform for the third or fourth time. And a number of times I've said to them, what do you think about me? They say, listen, Johnny. Firstly, they look at my physique and say thanks, but no thanks. Right. But second, I didn't serve when I was young, so I don't have that prior experience.
Right.
But thirdly, they say, I don't need you to go to the army. You're patur, you made Aliyah late. That itself is a great something to celebrate. But knowing that you're behind me 110%, that matters. I said, well, of course I am, brother. They say no. And that's the whole issue.
Yeah.
Israelis don't resent Olim who didn't serve in the army, who make Aliyah late, who don't go to the army. They don't resent it, not for a second. As long as they know that you're with me.
Right.
And that's what I've tried to do from the moment I've moved here, and certainly since then. And so I have friend going out this week, well, depending on what just happened a few
Right.
minutes before we
Really,
started recording.
right before we started talking, right.
Right. Who knows? Well, he's supposed to be.
Wow.
And that understanding of being at one with one another, that's what matters.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're gonna look different ways and we're gonna act different ways. And one other thing, I know we've been going for a while and I don't want to take up too much of your more of your time, but and I really appreciate the time that we've spent together. Something that's coming to mind for me is, when I speak with, taking this a little bit different direction, families of, young children or teenagers who are struggling with mental health challenges, often that comes together with challenges in Yiddishkeit, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's either like they were struggling in school or they were bullied or whatever. There's some whatever the situation is. Often when they're struggling with their mental health, keeping Torah mitzvahs is something that goes out the window. And so when parents call me, it's not necessarily because they're concerned about their child's mental health, but they're concerned about the lack of strength in Yiddishkeit. And
Mm.
and one of the things that I tell them is like, you have to look at all of this part as different parts of the same whole. The fact that they're struggling spiritually, you have to see it as that's part of the mental health challenge, right? It's not
Mm.
two separate things. They're not keeping Shabbos and not keeping mitzvahs because they're trying to shtech you, right? This is their spiritual response to their mental well-being. But we have to meet our kids where they're, of course, it's so challenging for a parent who's Shomer Torah mitzvahs to see their child not following in that exact path. And also, I truly, truly believe that our children's journeys are going to be the journeys they have to have, and we have to love and walk alongside them, even when they're making choices that we don't agree with. Maybe that's like a little bit of a hard take, but it's one I'm willing to stand behind because I really believe that, if we see often, and I think this could also go back to this thing of like how we label people as secular religious. We're seeing them for how they're not holding on our level. We don't know what their level is. That's between them and Hashem. They're like, that's not, we don't know what spiritual madrega they're on. That's not for us to necessarily know. But we
Mm.
have to meet people where they're at right now. Because if we want them to succeed in life, we have to meet them for where they're at, not for where they could be in 10 years from now if they follow the rules that we want them to follow.
I mean, I'd say 100% is absolutely. As a parent, I'm blessed to have five beautiful daughters. And, parents talk about the importance of unconditional love. But all too often, I meet religious parents who talk the talk but don't walk the walk. Unconditional love means looking at your kid who looks different to you, who acts different to you, who talks different to you, and saying from the depth of your being, I love you absolutely.
Mm.
And if a parent can't do that, that's nothing to do with the child. It's something to do with their understanding of the love they need to give their child.
Yep.
And too often, when a child feels that their love from their parent is conditional, they also think their love from God is conditional.
Mm.
And the parent's love is a reflection of the love that that child expects and hope for from their creator.
Right.
And so the parent actually is not response to the problem. The parent is themselves the problem, right? In Talmudic speak, we often distinguish between a siman, a sign, a siba, a reason. So as you're speaking, often a child perhaps shifting in their religious practice, we think that's the siba, that's the cause of everything. It's a siman. It's a sign of something completely different, of a child not necessarily finding their space and their place in their home and in their community and in their world. And what they're doing is they're trying to find themselves. In fact, tomorrow morning, I actually have the handout right in front of me. I'm giving a shiur at Matan in Yerushalayim titled The Holiness of Being Yourself,
Mm.
and explores a range of passages and teachings relating to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur about how true tshuva is about being the best version of yourself.
Oh.
And too often, what we do is we give off messages that that version of you isn't really the version we approve of. And, or while that person is in the journey of self-discovery, we make some negative comments. When I say we're talking about parents, we're talking about also teachers.
Right.
And a person loses sight of wanting to be themselves. They become a different version out of either spite or confusion.
Right.
And empowering people to be themselves is great. You know, I'll just tell you, I'll give you a 1 minute version of the hour-long shiur for tomorrow. But Rav Kook talks about how tshuva is really about the return to self. He says that explicitly. Anybody who has a Sefer Orot HaTshuva in chapter 15, section 10, he says, tshuva is about return to the ultimate self. And
Mm.
so you really, if you really, really are doing tshuva, you're going to come back to your ultimate self. I mentioned Rabbi Sachs before. He has a fascinating take of the ritual that the Kohen Gadol does on Yom Kippur, where you take two sheep, or it's identical, and one is basically sacrificed and one is sent the other way. And he reads into it the story of Yaakov and Esav.
Mm.
And he interprets it to be that times we get frustrated in life because we want to be somebody we're not,
Mm.
right? And he concludes this piece by saying, when I learned to let the not myself go, as the goat was let go on Yom Kippur, I find inner peace and can live at peace with the world.
Wow.
So he reads a whole ritual about the wrestling of who am I and who am I not. And just like one of those sheep, a goat, is kept and one is lost. And then finally, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, he arrives at the temple in his own clothes, and then he wears the white clothes and the gold clothes and the gold clothes and the white clothes. There's this whole ritual that's attached. But right at the end, he goes back and puts on his own clothes and goes home.
Right.
And the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a beautiful piece on that teaching. And he says, how come Maimonides codified the fact he puts on his own clothes and goes home? That's just like an afterthought. That's like an appendix to the law, right? And he says, no, that's the whole point.
Right.
Real tshuva is returning to yourself. Real tshuva is fitting back into your clothes, but being perhaps more thoughtful version of you. But it's
Yeah.
about being you. And so that's the pièce de résistance of the whole Yom Kippur process. If you take those three ideas, Rav Kook, returning to self, according to Rabbi Sachs, this idea of getting rid of the non-version of myself, and the Mishnah and the Rambam and the Rebbe basically saying, putting back on my own clothes and being at peace with myself, that is where tshuva exists.
Mm.
Being yourself, the holiness of being you. And to deny a Jew being themselves is to deny a Jew finding themselves.
Right.
And as we said before we started recording, a Jew who's not themselves is constantly looking for something. They're actually looking for who they are. That's why we need leaders, we need rabbis, we need rebbitzins to guide people. But we do harm. Doctors are told do no harm. Rabbis and rebbitzins should be told it double, right? We're too often people are confused about who they are, and they're looking for a part of themselves, and we tell them they're not that.
Wow.
When in reality, our job is to say, you are who God created you, and the best version of that. And I love you unconditionally.
Mm.
And Knowing that that person feels valued means that they are able to be at peace with whoever they are.
Yeah.
And it's creating that environment of support and a celebration of self, a recognition that just as much as Rav Tzadok Cohen says, you're supposed to believe in God, you're supposed to believe in yourself. And
Mm.
that means we need to believe in others. We need to create the conditions for people to believe in themselves too. And that's what we all need to do. And so those who suffer in different ways and those who are on journeys, those who are going through a mental health journey, amongst other things, often lose a part of themselves or lose sight from a part of themselves. And creating a supportive environment and being there with that person is how we help them heal. And turning our backs on them is basically how we diminish them. We lose them, and often sometimes leads to devastating conclusions. So recognizing the self and being there, I think, is part and parcel of our duty as Jews, and it's certainly part and parcel of our duty to celebrate life and value life, look out for the lives of others.
Right. Right. Wow. And what a powerful message to be going into Rosh Hashanah with, that really we're returning that reminder that we're returning to ourselves, and that for those who are listening who feel the exact opposite of whole, who are feeling so broken, I think that's such a beautiful message. And I hope that it really like deeply, people really absorb it and take that message with them into Rosh Hashanah, whatever that looks like for them, in shul, out of shul, wherever, you know.
Wherever, don't be an actor any day of the year, and certainly not on those days of the year,
Mm.
right? You don't need to act the part. You just need to hear you be you. It's not even be the best version of you, actually. I stop myself. Hear you be you, because sometimes I don't know what the best version of me is, but I know that today's version of me is broken.
Right.
Right now, that's who I am. And hearing that and being at peace with that, that's how I can be at whole with myself and figure out how to move forward.
Right. So often I think people are wanting to disengage from that part of themselves that feels broken, but I think in order to get to that next phase, you have to feel it. You have to.
Well, historically, that is what Yom Kippur is. Because what is Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is a culmination of the third unit of 40 days. The first began on Shiva Saba Tammuz, on the 17th of Tammuz, when Moshe brings the luchot, the tablets, and smashes them. And then Moshe pleads to God to not destroy the people having built the golden calf. Then in Yom Kippur, right, Moshe brings down the new tablets, meaning Yom Kippur is the affirmation that we can build things out of the broken parts. And Rav Soloveitchik, at the end of his essay Catharsis, says each one of us has to go through the process of the breaking of the tablets in order to find our whole self. He
Mm.
says this. And so when a person is standing before God on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and saying, I'm broken, I'd say the reason we have these days is because that's what the Jewish people were. And the reason we have these days is because God says, I'm there for those, whether they see themselves as being broken or whole. There's room in the ark for both. Even in the ark, we kept the broken tablets because the broken tablets are holy too. We never throw away those who feel broken. And we believe that through breaking, we can achieve a sense of wholeness. So wherever you are in that journey, God is with you.
Mm.
And the whole idea of Yom Kippur is recognizing that it is a journey and it takes time and it takes God's support. So whether you feel that you've come down ready for something new or you've just been shattered, or you're not quite sure and you're in the in-between where you're not sure which way it's going to go, or you've got the new but you also feel the fractures of the past, join the Jewish people. That's who we are. That's what Yom Kippur is about. That's what the High Holy Days are about. It's about recognizing that God is with us in every moment, and saying, "You're not alone."
Oh, wow. I'm gonna breathe into that. Thank you. I feel like when we were talking before, before we recorded, you said something that made me cry. And I'm like, I feel like when I record these shows so often, the questions that I have about my own life end up getting answered inadvertently. So thank you for that. But
It's been a great privilege speaking with you, Lee. And it's important for me to say, and nothing I've said is new, is particularly clever. What I try and do is read beautiful Torah ideas and share beautiful Torah ideas, which are both authentic and real, but also emotionally intelligent. You know, the story of the broken tablets and the whole ones is right there in the Bible. It's right there in Shemot, you know, from chapter 20 to chapter 34. But what we read into that can either just be a historical story or our story.
right.
And I believe our Jewish tradition is so rich, is so profound, and each one of us can find ourselves in our story. And that's the genius of people like Rav Soloveitchik and Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Nachman and the Rebbe, who were able to take these small moments of the story of the Kohen Gadol changing back his clothes, or the breaking of the Luchot, or the conversation of Yitzchak in the field, and transform it into a theology. And as a religious leader, a spiritual leader, my job is to make Torah live and speak to the people I'm privileged to talk with. And that's why I learn, but also that's why we have opportunities like this to speak. And anybody who's listening, if anything that we've said together speaks to you, I'm so pleased. And I know that you matter.
Ah, that's, I mean, I feel like we could do a mic drop now.
Let's do a mic drop.
Mic drop. Rabbi Johnny, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your insight and for taking this time to connect with me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care. Shana Tova.
Thank you for tuning in to Heart to Heart. If you or someone you love is struggling, please know there is hope and help is within reach. Since 2019, the Long Short Road has been walking alongside at-risk individuals, offering trauma-informed programs, a non-emergency hotline, and a community that fosters healing. No one has to go through this alone, and we are here for you. Discover how the Long Short Road is changing lives. Visit www.thelongshortroad.com or email us at info@thelongshortroad.com to learn more. You can be part of this mission. Sponsorship opportunities for Heart to Heart are available. Honor a loved one, support your community, and help us make mental wellness resources accessible to those who need them most. Until next time, remember, love and connection are the greatest healers. This is Lee Yaffe reminding you, hope is here, healing is possible, and you are never alone. Together, we're walking this long, short road to a brighter future.